almost separation from the academic portion of the university. But that wasn't always the case. And when I look back at the 1960 season we're about to talk about, I really viewed this as the beginning of the era where college football started to become something else, something of its own beyond the academic mission of the university. And as I mentioned, I am a football fan, but I didn't start out as a college football fan. I wasn't born into it like some of our southern SEC brethren are. And the reason I was not initially a college football fan, I put the blame on the University of Missouri Tigers. Because I grew up in the 1980s. And there wasn't a lot of good football to watch at that time. And so, I watched college basketball, I watched NFL, but all those things. But I came to school as an undergraduate, and Larry Smith was the coach, and the Tigers started to have a little bit of a resurgence. And I started to take an interest and really enjoy football Saturday. And so, as Gary Pinkel came along, and the Tigers have really come, into the resurgence, I have become a huge fan, and I began to look back on, the history of this program because I didn't know much about it. And I came across, I was reading something, I saw a line that one year the Tigers went 11-0, and I thought, well, they should have been national champions that year, 11-0. But they weren't, and I didn't know why. So I did a little more digging, and I saw that there was an asterisk attached to that 11-0 season. And I did a little more digging, and as I was reading more and more about this team, this is a really interesting season. So much of the things that we see in modern day college football, recruiting violations, shady recruiting, or high profile, big money games, all those things that we think of college football now, were really taking part in this 1960 season. So I'm going to delve in a little bit about what's become my favorite college football season in Mizzou football history, the 1960 Missouri Tigers. So the thing about Missouri Tiger history, football-wise, you can't talk about it without talking about this man, Don Perot. Obviously, one of the longest-serving college football coaches in Mizzou's history, except for a brief stint during World War II. He served from 1935 to 1956 as its head coach, and he also served as an athletic director. And Don Perot had a reputation of kind of being a Boy Scout. He was very, he didn't curse, didn't drink, and he also had a reputation a little bit being tight with the budget. And there was a stretch of, I think, 9 years where he scheduled Ohio State as a season opener for Mizzou, because when he took the reins as the athletic director, the athletic department was $500,000 in the red. And by scheduling Ohio State, that brought in revenue. But they lost 9 straight games. So it's good for the budget, not so good for the team. And so anyway, Don Perot, in 1956, he had this wonderful reputation. He built the program. Teams had started to recede a little bit, and in the early 50s. And he wanted to focus on his athletic director role. And so he, being the athletic director, had the ability to sort of appoint his successor as the head coach. And he wanted to find someone who would, like him, build the program to the next level and would be dedicated to the Tiger football team. So he found a really highly regarded assistant coach at Georgia Tech, a guy named Frank Broyles. And a lot of you probably know who Frank Broyles is if you're a football fan, because he has been a long-time successful coach, but not at Missouri. He spent 1 year at Missouri, because immediately after taking the job at Missouri, he started to butt heads with Don Perot a little bit. Because another thing that Don Perot was famous for was he felt that Missouri's football team should be fielded by Missouri boys. And he wanted to recruit in-state. And as I mentioned, college football was expanding in those days, and this was a little out of step with the times. If you wanted to win at the top caliber level, you needed to find the best players from around the country, and that's what Frank Broyles wanted to do. He wanted to be an elite coach for an elite team. And so after one season, he looked around the state of Missouri at high schools and the amount of high schools that had football that didn't, St. Louis, Kansas City, and he just didn't think there was enough talent in state to win at the level he wanted to. And he ruffled a lot of feathers because he left after one season, and he said the Missouri guys, they have their head in the clouds. If they want to be an Ivy League school, they should be an Ivy League school. If they want to play football, they should play football. So he left and went to Arkansas, where he spent 40 plus years still there, and was very successful. But one thing he did before he left that had a huge impact, even though he was here for one season, is he recruited the first African-American players to the University of Missouri team. Never before in the university's history, only 10 years, only 1950 was the first year that Missouri even had black students, but they had never had black football players. A guy named Al Abrams was the first ever athlete for the basketball team. But Norris Stevenson and Mel West, recruited by Frank Broyles, became the first black players on the Missouri team. And so that impact from his 1957 year would carry on to the 60 season I'm here to talk about today. So anyway, Don Thoreau found himself after one season having to replace this head coach. He wanted to have a guy who would last a long time like he did, and he found himself 1 year later looking for another guy. So he had this Southerner in Frank Broyles, and so he found this Michigan boy named Dan Devine to try to take Missouri to the next level after Broyles didn't get it done. So Dan Devine had coached at Arizona State. He was very successful. Arizona State at the time wasn't even considered really like what we call now a Division I school, but at that time he took them to a perfect 10-0 season. And Sun Devil Stadium began to be built during Dan Devine's era because he brought so much popularity and money into that program. So Dan Devine was hired to be the coach at Mizzou. And one thing lingering over Dan Devine's head when he started here at Missouri was that the last coach said you can't win here. And so here he is trying to further his career. He's a young man. He's a highly regarded coach on the up and up. And he's going to a place where the last coach said you can't win. And so that was in the back of Dan Devine's mind during his first season in 1958. And he would test this theory with the guys that Frank Broyles had recruited because one of their games early in the 1958 season was against the Michigan Wolverines, who had the same reputation in football then that they do today. And they didn't just have to play Michigan, they had to play Michigan in the big house in Michigan. And so Dan Devine took his team up to Michigan. He was depressed from the get-go because the pep rallies at Michigan were way better than Missouri. He's like, the pep rallies are better, the football team's bound to be. And so they took the field, and Missouri, everybody's surprised, played pretty well. And not just pretty well, by the end of the game, on a last-second touchdown dive, Missouri upset Michigan 20-15. And it was one of the biggest wins in the program's history, right out of the gate. And so Dan Devine began to think, maybe Broyles is wrong. Maybe we can win here. And so he began a campaign to kind of follow Don Thoreau's lead and try to recruit talent from in-state, but he also tried to, and Don Thoreau learned a lesson that times are changing, you kind of have to change with it, so he allowed Devine to recruit from outside the state as well. So it did open up opportunities for Devine that maybe Broyles didn't have. Now, with all this going on, there's another important storyline to the 1960 season that had nothing to do with Missouri. And this has to do with a guy named Bert Cohn. So if you're a football fan, you know who this guy is, probably. He's from Pasadena, Texas, outside of Houston. Great track athlete and fantastic football player. And he decided to go to school at TCU. It's closer to home than some of the other schools that recruited him, and he thought he could be successful in both track and field and football, which were both important to him. But there was another guy in the Houston area who got the attention or who saw Bert Cohn and kind of liked what he saw, and it was a Kansas alum, a guy named Bud Adams. Now, Bud Adams came from an oil family in Oklahoma. He moved down to Texas. He made millions of dollars. Huge football guy too, because he had begun the AFL and started a Houston Oilers team around this time. So he was keenly interested in college football talent because, as with a new fledgling league competing with the NFL had to find their talent cheap, and college athletes where they could get cheap talent. They couldn't hire away as many big players in the NFL. And he was also a Kansas man, as I mentioned. And so Bert Cohn did something a little out of bounds for even then, which is while Bert Cohn was at TCU, Bud Adams came to visit him and said, you know, there's a college football all-star game in Chicago. Why don't you come with me? Hop in my plane, his private plane, and they had just won the national title in track. And so that had appealed to Bert Cohn. And of course, Bud Adams thought the football team's pretty good too. And he would let that be known to Bert. Well, shortly after this trip, Bert Cohn made a trip to Lawrence, Kansas, and decided he was going to transfer. And the TCU athletic department was none too happy about that, and they made it public that they thought there was something fishy going on. And so, but regardless, Bert Cohn was now a Jayhawk. 1960 comes. And one of the first things that goes on in 1960 is University of Kansas gets a letter of inquiry from the NCAA. We think that something fishy might be going on with the recruiting process, specifically around Bert Cohn. And there were a lot of rumors once this letter of inquiry went out, because Kansas had been involved in another fishy recruiting episode a couple years prior with the basketball team. There was a well-regarded player from a poor urban part of Philadelphia. He was this really tall, good-looking black kid, and he went to this rural, super white, surrounded by cattle town of Lawrence, Kansas. And it couldn't have been more fish out of water. And people said, wow, how would you recruit this kid? The kid was named Wilt Chamberlain. And so he drew a few eyes, he drew a few eyes. And while he was on campus, I mentioned that he didn't come from a lot of money. Every year he had a new convertible. And didn't seem to know where it came from, no titles or anything. So, but the NCAA was never really able to pin Kansas down for it. So a lot of people started, and Lawrence thought, this isn't about Bert Cohn, it's about Wilt Chamberlain. They got crossed the Maryland. So, regardless of what Kansas was up to, because I don't like to dwell on that, Dan Devine's team was looking at what they needed to do to improve on the last couple of years, where they'd had moderate level of success in Dan's first couple of years, to be even better. Because they didn't have a very large team. The guys weren't too big. But Al Onofrio, you see here, was the master of defense for Dan Devine, and Dan Devine trusted him implicitly. And so they were going to focus this team around defense. They had an offense that they relied on that was very, very simple. They had these sweep plays. The quarterback would pitch it back to the running back. The quarterback would then block, and everybody else would have a wall of blockers, and they called it student body left or student body right. They didn't know which way they were blocking, because it was actually an Air Force coach had dubbed them that, because when Missouri first launched this offense, he said, it looks like the entire damn student body is blocking for their rushing back. So that's a student body left and student body right concern. But defense was the key to this team. So a couple of the players on the team get to know. Danny LaRose is the biggest guy on this team. Biggest, strongest guy. He's like 6'2", 225. Biggest guy. Their quarterback, Ron Taylor, he's about my size, about 5'8". Even by 1960 standards, that was a small quarterback. And so a couple other guys you might want to know. Donnie Smith, he was part of the three-headed running back corps for the Tigers at that time that ran the sweeps. And then Norm Beal, who was a cornerback and also did a little rushing. Because in those days, they played both directions, defense and offense. It was real iron man. And then, of course, Ed Blank, guy some of you guys may have heard of course, famous from the Dalton Center here. A wonderful career in pharmaceutical research as well as on the football field. And then Andy Russell, who probably had one of the most successful NFL careers of any former Tiger, who he was on the steel curtain defense for the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 70s. Terry Bradshaw wrote 2 books about his time on the Steelers. And of course, these 2 gentlemen I mentioned earlier, Norris Stevens and Mel West. Now, they were seniors by this time, and so they were part of the leadership of the team. Along with Donnie Smith, they were the running backs too. And they had had a very different experience than the rest of the team, because not only were the first 2 black players, they were still the only 2 black players on this team. And Columbia, Missouri was not necessarily the easiest place to be a black athlete at that time. Of course, a lot of you know this was kind of referred to as Little Dixie area, and some of the culture at the games, even in 1960, was not too conducive to. If you were a young black athlete to really get out there and celebrate with these guys. The wave the rebel flag at games, and played Dixie after touchdowns, and it's not, you celebrate, you're a black athlete, you score a touchdown, and you're rewarded by getting your Dixie. They didn't like it so much, obviously. So I got another voice thing, but I don't know if it's going to play. So I'll skip through. This is Nora Stevenson's wife. And Nora Stevenson's deceased. And she told me about their time on campus and the struggles that he had. Particularly, they went to Texas A&M. A lot of the struggles they had were on the road. They would go to Texas A&M, they'd stop at a restaurant, eat. The restaurant wouldn't allow black players to eat there. So Missouri's guys, they've been together for 4 years. They really gathered around Norris and Mel, and they refused to eat there too. They all left the restaurant together, and they refused to eat there. And this happened several times. Hotels, it would happen with hotels. They wouldn't let black players stay at the hotel. The team would go find a different hotel, even if they had to drive out of town. And that was Dan Devine's doing. Remember, Dan Devine had coached out west. It didn't have the same sort of racial problems that they did in the South and even here in Missouri. And so he was very sensitive to the plight that his black players had. Now, I'm going to go to the first game that Missouri played. And I mentioned earlier that Ohio State had beaten Missouri like 9 straight times. Well, Missouri had a record of 13 straight years where they had lost their season opener. And so, Dan Devine was keenly aware of this. He was a superstitious guy. And so they played SMU at home their first game, and they pounded them 20-0. Had a great win and got this monkey off their back, and they were ready to start the season with success. And so that was the first touch of success. They went and played Oklahoma State. This was their first year in the Big 8 Conference. They weren't any good. They beat Oklahoma State. And then they had their very first real test against Penn State. Penn State had a great program then, like they do now. They were on the road again. And Danny LaRose, who I mentioned earlier, had a fantastic game. He had a couple interceptions. He ran a touchdown. He was all over the field. And at the time, Pittsburgh Pirates were playing the New York Yankees in the World Series. And the World Series was going back to Pittsburgh, and there was a lot of press from the East Coast in Pennsylvania, and they drove out to this game because even though it was a good way from Pittsburgh, there was an off day between the World Series. They wanted something to do, so this was a big game. And so a lot of the press got to see Danny LaRose perform, and Missouri beat Penn State 21-8. Impressive win on the road. Both teams ranked. Missouri just crawled into the rankings for the first time. And as all this was going on, the NCAA wrapped up their investigation with Kansas. And they said, nope, you absolutely recruited illegally. Bert Cohn should not have been recruited off campus by one of your alums. That was a foul. And as punishment, you will not be allowed to go to a bowl game this year. And so any bowl chances for the Jayhawks were immediately squashed. But what it also did is got the ball rolling with the Big 8 Conference. Because they said, well, if Kansas is recruited illegally according to NCAA rules, maybe he's recruited illegally according to our conference rules too. And in this day, the conferences were actually more powerful than the NCAA. Taking that bowl game away was basically all the NCAA could do at that time. So the Big 8 started talking about what's Kansas done and right what have they done wrong. But anyway, Tigers kept moving on, winning games against Air Force, Kansas State, beating Missouri. We're top 5 teams in the country now. Beat Nebraska 28-0. They are rolling. And you can see, nobody scored 10 points against them yet. The defense of Al Alfredo is working to a charm. Well, as all these games are rolling on, the Big 8 comes knocking on Kansas' door and said, hey, what's the Bert Cohn situation? You got these rules of eligibility. It looks like you might have broken them. Kansas said, we're fine. We're fine. We didn't do anything wrong. They said, well, maybe you ought to consider not playing Bert Cohn since these NCAA violations. He said, nah, he's good. We did fine. Don't worry about it. They said, well, we'd like you to give us a report at our next conference meeting, which was not until the end of the regular season. So, Missouri kept on playing football. They had to play Colorado, which was one of the toughest opponents in the Big 8. And beat them. Number 2 team in the country now. Now, the biggest challenge Missouri was going to face at all was Oklahoma, because nobody beat Oklahoma in these days. This is in the 10 years prior to this game. They won 4 Orange Bowls, 3 national titles, and 14 straight Big 8 titles. And the Tigers were going to Norman, Oklahoma to play them, and no Big 8 team has beaten Oklahoma in Norman since World War II. And on top of that, 2 years prior, Dan Devine got beat 39-0. And nobody took it harder than Norris Stevens. He fumbled in that game, and it really took a lot of the blame. He was crying in the locker room after it was over. But this year was to be different. 1960, Norris had 2 60-yard run touchdowns, and he beat the snot out of Oklahoma. Now, I've got video, but there's probably no sound, so we're probably going to skip through it. Or it might not even play. But it's just footage of Norris Stevens being interviewed, and it shows the 60-yard runs. But what happened after that game is Columbia went wild. Missouri flew on these old DC-3s, Ozark Airlines. They had 2 planes, one called Black, one called Gold. The guys told me they had 2 planes, and they would put half the team on each plane in case one went down. That's how much faith they had in these airplanes. They were World War II airplanes. Well, this game, as they were coming into Columbia, they had to circle around the airport because the runway was covered. It was covered in people. There were people from all over the area coming to welcome home the champion Tigers over to Oklahoma. There was a lot of celebration. I don't know. I assume it's all soda. Yeah. But they had an impromptu parade. Fire trucks took Missouri back to campus. They gave speeches. Students tried to get the day off. That didn't work that well. But Missouri was ranked #1 in the country after that. So anyway, it's the first time Missouri ever been #1 in the country, and so there was tons of jubilation. And the next game was the final game to determine the national title, homecoming against Kansas Jayhawks. Now, I don't know, see this sign here, Ahab? I don't know if that rings a bell with anybody. You know what that is. See it again here. But now, I really hate that the audio is down because a guy named Jerry Wallace was on that team. Told the story about these Ahab buttons. Jerry Wallace was on the team, and he said he was at a place called the M Bar with his friends, and he saw some signs that said Ahab, and he said, "What does that Ahab mean?" And his buddy said, "All hawkers are bastards." I don't like that. I don't like that. So they drove to St. Louis Button Company, bought like 2,000 buttons. Jerry didn't have any money, so he wrote a no-account check for the buttons. And they promised to have them delivered by the end of the day. He drove back to Columbia, went to practice. His buddies started selling these buttons. And he didn't know if they were going to go or not. And he'd written this check for it. He comes back to his dorm. There's a pile of money on his bed. They were selling like hotcakes. The next day he goes to Al Price, president of the bank, and he says, he told him what he did. And the guy goes, "You ought not do that. You get in trouble for that." He goes, "Yeah, it's covered. We got it." And so he had him open up an account. The check was good. And he goes, "It was a real entrepreneurship deal. These Ahab buttons." He goes, until the bottom fell out about halftime. And the reason for that was Kansas was ready for Missouri. They knew about the sweep, and they took a big risk that Missouri would not go away from the sweep, not try to pass up the middle. Missouri did not pass a lot, not try to run up the middle. And Dan Devine he said to his team, he was going to stick with the girl that brought it. And they ran the sweep. And I had Norm Beal here to tell you about this 23-7 loss, in which, by the way, Burt Combs scored 2 touchdowns. And Norm said he never cried like a baby until after that game. He said never had he gotten a pitch from Ron Taylor, the quarterback, and as immediately as he touched the ball, he got tackled. Never had that happen. He said they were just flat. They over-practiced. They were too concerned. And so basically their national title hopes were shot because the AP in those days picked the national champion before the bowl games. So immediately after the regular season was over, they picked the national champion. And Missouri had fallen off its #1 perch. So they had to pick somebody, or a lot of one-loss teams. They chose the University of Minnesota. They didn't want to be the national champion. Now, if they had waited a week, the Big 8 had a vote to determine whether Kansas had recruited Burt Cohn illegally and whether they had played Burt Cohn illegally after telling them not to. And Kansas did a lot of politicking, trying to get people on their side. They really needed Oklahoma. They really put hard on Oklahoma. They didn't know if that was going to work out. When the vote came down, should Burt Cohn be ruled ineligible? All right. Here's the key. So, Oklahoma State was new. They were crushing. So anyway, it was official that Bert Cohn was ruled ineligible, and the games that they played Bert Cohn after they talked to him had to be forfeited. Missouri had their win back from Kansas. They were now 11-0, even though the title had been decided. But admit that the Tigers were going to the Orange Bowl. There's Bert Cohn again. Tell a great story. He admitted to being recruited illegally, which I was really excited about because he did not admit to it at the time. But he said a lot of water passed the bridge. He didn't mind. So, at the aftermath of this, Kansas went crazy. The newspapers, it was all over the country. Kansas is just pleased, that's not good. Missouri takes the lead with the action. Kansas went to the press to protest about it. The chancellor, the athletic director, they were talking about how they were robbed. It came to no avail. Everybody in Kansas was full of it. So, but the Kansas alumni bought into it because the chancellor's desk was getting one after the other these telegrams, and they were all, "We need to withdraw from the conference. You have our full support. Unjust, unwarranted harassment of our university." So anyway, Missouri gets to go to the Orange Bowl. 71,000 people, record crowd. One of the guys in attendance. Oh, there's the Tigers with their suitcases loading up the train into Miami Beach. On the beach playing. The reason I brought this slide up is because the Ivanhoe Hotel where the team stayed, two guys did get to go swimming. North Stevenson and Mel West. The hotel did not allow black African Americans in the pool, and the year before they didn't allow blacks in the hotel at all. Now, Danny Devine was worried about the football game. He didn't put up the same sort of fuss that he had earlier. And that North Stevenson took that to heart. He felt like his coach didn't really stand up for him in that moment. But as the game would go on, people have to put these things aside for a minute. And the big crowd, as I mentioned, one of the guys in attendance, John F. Kennedy, president-elect. He'd just been elected president. He was at the game. Now, Missouri was playing Navy, and he's a former Navy man, so he wasn't necessarily ready for our Tigers. Joe Bellino was the star running back for Navy. He was a Heisman Trophy winner. He's expected to run all over Missouri. Missouri held him to 4 yards rushing. Good launch defense. Nobody expected that, and the game started out rough. I have another video we can't show, but anyway, Missouri lost the fumbles, and Navy scored a touchdown, longest touchdown run in history, and Missouri plowed on back and won the game. 21-14. But anyway, Bellino redeemed himself with a great circus catch at the end, but it wasn't enough. Missouri came out, won, beat the number 4 Navy team, the best player in the country, and celebrated on the field with a huge win. Now again, the Indian Creek Country Club, exclusive, beautiful country club in Miami, had an award ceremony after the game. 8 p.m., North Stevenson, Mel West get a tap on the shoulder. We need you to leave. We have a policy, no Negroes allowed in the club after 8 p.m. They were not allowed to get their award with the rest of their team. And again, no name on it. So, North Stevenson was especially upset about this. And he had a very close felt relationship with his coach, but there was a rift after this. My contingency is Missouri was national champions. The reason why is because when the Bowls happened, number 1 Minnesota lost the Orange Bowl, or the Rose Bowl to Washington. Number 2 Ole Miss, who's 10-1 with the tie. They played an unranked Rice team, was not very well regarded, and had to come back at the last second, barely beat them, very unimpressively. Iowa didn't get to go to the bowl at all because Minnesota was a Big Ten rep. Navy, of course, got beat by Missouri, and Missouri, now 11-0, beats number 4 Navy in the Orange Bowl. So I feel like that's a pretty good shot at it. The aftermath of that season, the AP began choosing national championship after the bowl season in 1965. Shocking. There's a mathematically based polling system. They did choose Missouri as a national champion based on the season they had. And Daniel LaRose was named unanimous All-American, along with a guy named Mike Ditka. So, and then Kansas and Missouri are still battling about what their record is. Depending on which side of the Missouri-Kansas border you live on, you're 57-54-9 or 56-55-9. I can't go to 57. So anyway, the animosity ran deep into the basketball season. This was a fight on Brewer Field, house floor between Kansas and Missouri. Fist fight, blood on the court, fans on the court. That band was playing the national anthem to try to get them to calm down. So, but anyway, they, Nora Stevenson spoke after this about how close the two men were and how much they loved each other, and a lifetime of healing over a few moments of tension. So, anyway, and as many of us know, Dan Weinstein throughout the 60s would be a gold era for us, and then went on to take his home national championship. So, that is the 1960s. Well, I mean, I can't say to what. I mean, Gary Biggles aware of this story, I'm sure. He and Nora Stevenson actually had a relationship because he reached out to Nora Stevenson early in his tenure as coach to help bridge the gap between black athletes in St. Louis and the university, because they had a tough time recruiting black athletes to the university when he started, and Nora Stevenson agreed to help him do that. So I'm sure that they had shared stories. How much, I can't say.
Other questions?
Yeah.
I can get to Columbia for 75. This side is on the front side.
Yes, this parking lot here is the Art Center. Yeah, you're looking east. And so this is a new addition at the time. Most of the time when I go to games, I get good tickets right around this wooded area here. So, but yeah, that's right.
Do you have an Ahab button?
I do not. I would love one. Yeah. I'll tell you what, Norm Beal
I'd
did.
love to get rid of it.
Norm Beal willed me his helmet after we spoke a number of times. But yeah, no, I don't. And I have some programs from that year, but that's about it. They were $1 piece back then, I'm sure.
Brendan, do we know anything about how the two black football players were treated back on campus the following semester after that bowl game?
So Dolores Stevenson and Sharon West, Mel West's wife, they talked a little bit about that, and they said that really the worst year on campus were the guys who were the freshman year. And for the most part, they spoke very highly of their teammates, but there was an article in the Post-Dispatch several years ago before Norris died where he mentioned there were some of the guys that he didn't mention names, who would walk by him on campus like he was a stranger when they weren't on the practice field together. Both the widows mentioned that there was somewhat of a celebrity status to be on the football team, and so they chose not to take part in a lot of sit-ins that were going on at the time. But and so I don't think as such they had quite the same problems that other black students might have faced. But they certainly did on the road, and especially when they went south for games.
Other questions? Well, especially to Brendan,